introduce our keynote speaker, who has spoken at various homeschool venues and has just been so kind to come and speak for us. I'm not sure how to introduce her, except she's a friend.
Yes.
And we share a name. And we're both writers.
Yes.
And basically homeschool mentors. And we both wrote curricula for Texas history. So we met at a feast thing, and we had tables next to each other. And I had my Texas history thing, and she had hers. And I think hers is better.
Not sure about that.
We still recommend yours for some kind of post.
Thank you. She's definitely an expert on Texas history. So if you have a question on anything, you can ask her. And she's just an all-around good resource person. So take it away.
Okay. I tend to turbo talk, so I hope we'll get to the end and you can have time left over to ask any questions you want. I want to talk to you today, though, about the mind-expanding difference between school and home education. Because, like Lynn said, one of our resources when we start to home educate, to homeschool, is how we were raised, what our friends are doing. I was raised in public school. Most of my friends, when we began, were public schoolers. We started homeschooling in 1989. My daughter was horrified to learn that it wasn't fully legal at the time, later, when she was grown. But I think she had a bit of admiration. She was like, Mom, ooh. It's like, yeah. So, but it's different because our whole mindset is geared towards school. And school and education are not necessarily synonymous. You can sit in a school for 13 years and learn absolutely nothing if you're not interested at all. And you can become educated in any number of ways that don't require you to sit in a schoolhouse. So we're going to talk about some of those ways. I'm sure if you've homeschooled any time at all, you already have picked up that homeschool is more than just doing school at home, right? And that was especially important during COVID to remember, because the government schools were sending government-funded curricula home with the parents, and those parents considered themselves homeschooling because they were doing the work and they were doing it at home. Totally understand their confusion. But really they were unpaid volunteer teachers being compulsively told they must carry out the government's program at home. We're not. Whatever we use, we can choose and buy ourselves because it's our choice. Okay? A teacher who relies only on textbooks is like an artist with only one crayon. You can draw a picture, but it may or may not be very interesting. And I loved what Lynn said about how you need to go with what's natural for you and what's natural for your child. Don't we all say we learned in school, but we learned far more once we got out of school? School of Knox, school of life. So do our kids. So do our kids. A phrase that I hear a lot of new homeschool moms ask that is it began to, once I caught it, I was like, that's rather alarming. They would write to the blogs and they would say, how do I make my daughter do this? How much should I make my son do? If I tell you I'm going to make you do something, is your instant response not immediately, oh yeah? Try, you know? There's just something about being coerced that's not inviting. Okay, So I would ask, do you vividly remember even one page of any textbook you were ever made to read in school? I don't. I know I did learn something, but it was not memorable in a fond sort of way. It was not the sort of learning that made me go, ooh, I want more. It was like, did that. I actually know a young family member who graduated high school and said, well, thank you, Lord, that's over. I hope I never have to learn another blessed thing in my life. That's sad. I don't want my children to get it over with and then never learn again. I want them to fall in love with learning. And in the end, it is actually much easier to create a masterpiece when you acquire a wider range of options. When you're not just using textbooks, which was what our example growing up was. It's not that there's anything necessarily wrong with the textbook. You're just not limited to it. 80% of girls are visual learners. Textbooks work great for them. 60% or 65% of Americans as a whole are visual learners. What does that say? You do the math. What does that say for the boys? Maybe 40%? And the rest of them feel chained to that chair and can't wait to get out. All right. I'm going to use for you the subject of Texas history to demonstrate how I liked to pull all of them together, because I like to teach all of my kids at one time and not have to teach each of them separately. You'll make yourself crazy that way. But if you're going to teach together, they have to each be able to get from it what they need. And you have to be able to teach what's comfortable for you. So I'm going to use Texas history as an example of the ultimate dead subject, because everybody we're learning about is dead. And if they're dead, why do I care what they did? They've done it now. Ain't no changing it. Well, the first thing we have to understand about history, or really any other subject, is that without knowing the subject in context, in history's case, the people in their context and their challenges, we cannot possibly understand why anything matters. You know? If somebody walked up to you out of the blue and said, look, I've invented a dingle hopper, you'd be like, I'm happy for you. What good is that to me? It has to be interesting. Otherwise, we're making them memorize stuff that makes no sense to them. History, it turns out, is a story. Actually, it is his story. If you're Christian, it's God's story of how he is working his redemptive plan through men in all of their eras and times and epochs, which means I'm part of history. What you're doing here today, by tomorrow, will be history. It will incrementally change things. Oh, okay. Well, then, like all stories, it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, and it really helps to know what chapter I'm in. You know, if I'm trying to figure out why am I here, what do I want to do with my life, then history becomes much more interesting because I know where I fit. I know which chapter I'm a character in. Instead, we kind of do it like this. These children are learning history. Sort of. That picture is about as clear as the ones in my Texas history book. That my coach sat on his desk and read to us. First period after lunch in an unair-conditioned room in a monotone. Because he didn't like history either. And he could not wait to get out on the football field, which was what they hired him to teach, not history. It was painfully obvious. My biggest struggle that year was not the test, it was staying awake. It was just awful. And when I went to a homeschool book fair and asked them what they had to teach Texas history with, they reached under the table and pulled out the same book. It had not gotten any better for being 30 years older. Okay. It also helps if we know what the story is about. Otherwise, how are we going to learn from it? What's the point? I won't mention it by name, but I see a lot of parents just loving a certain particular history curriculum that's very popular now. It is not a Christian curriculum. It's not that it's a bad curriculum. It will teach you what happened. But the point, their takeaway point, is very different than mine. Okay? Their objective in what they hope the children will take from it is very different than mine. If you are secular, you will want to pick a very different curriculum than the one I wrote. Because I wrote one that would teach my kiddos the way I wished I had been taught. These kids are also learning about history. These are pictures of my kids, my classes that I taught at co-op, and I guarantee they were having a whole lot more fun than I had in my history course. Okay? The best stories, whether you're reading them or whether they're a school book, the best stories are the ones that touch us, that relate to our lives, and that let us in some way experience the adventures for ourselves. If you only read science experiments and you never get to pour vinegar on baking soda and make a volcano, if you never get to dissect the frog, if you are lectured on grammar and you're never allowed to read a library book. And yet we do that with history. When you make it an adventure, it becomes more, the learning of it becomes more meaningful to you personally, easier to remember in the long haul because it's fun. I may or may not remember what some stranger did who died 150 years ago, but I will remember what I did last year. So if you involve your children in their learning, then it's not a memory of somebody I don't know or care about. It's a memory of something that happened to them. All right, studies actually show that we only remember 10% of what we read. And about 20% of what we hear. So in a lecture, I can stand up here and rattle for 40 minutes. You won't remember necessarily. If we see it, like go and view something or watch a video, 30. And if it's presented in a way that's passive, with several different, you're using visual, you're using a lecture, audio, you're bringing in a video. It's still passive though. It doesn't include them. But with all that, you can boost it to 50. When you make learning active, when the child or the student gets to experience something for themselves, join in a discussion, simulate a dramatic presentation, participate in a reenactment, tell other people what they've learned, even if it's just grandma or you at the end of the day when dad comes home and says, "What'd you learn?" If they are involved, retention jumps to 70 to 90%. I want that. Multisensory learning is a lot more fun and it's also more effective. I would submit it's probably effective because it's fun. Scientists tell us that if you're doing drill and kill as your teaching method, it takes 400 repetitions, 400, speed drills in maths, 400 spelling tests, write the word 400 times before it's ingrained in you, unless you're playing. If you can make a game out of it, 10 to 20 reps and they got it. If it's fun and intriguing to them, they learn a lot faster because it's interesting. So I'm going to skip through a couple of these really quickly. Multisensory layers make any lesson more meaningful and memorable, and every time you add a sensory layer to the lesson, you add depth and vibrancy to the child's experience. So we have 5 senses, right? We have sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell. How come we just teach with 2? Usually, read the book, listen to the lecture, take the test. it's very ineffective. That's down in that 30% range. So what you've got that I gave you is a worksheet. When you're putting together a lesson for your kiddos, whether you use a textbook, you can, but use it as a spine. And at least once a week, try and spark things up by adding something to see and hear, touch, taste, smell, and know, something to do and someplace to go. So that's one of the worksheets I gave you, and you can, if you want to make copies, that's fine too. With something to see, don't just depend on textbooks. I had them, but I used them as kind of the outline, the backbone, to get the facts down and build from. You can also use library books. Big question now is, we need funding. Curricula is expensive. The library is free. And the books are way more interesting. And if you want to, if you don't want to go to the library, don't have access, join Amazon Prime and you can borrow them from there, read them and turn them back. The author still gets paid. You don't pay anything but your once a year fee, and your other shipping's free. Okay. Science experiments are something you can see, but they're fun. Math manipulatives are something you can see, but they're also touching and moving them around. Making a nature journal. So yes, they're out looking, but they're also involved in recording. Vision can open the door to curiosity. Likewise, hearing something isn't just a lecture. Lectures are, like me, a little boring. Stories, tell them stories, they'll remember those. It's a reason preachers start every sermon with a story. Poetry is fun to listen to, fun to make up. Classic literature. Did any of you guys have teachers that read to you over your lunch period? After lunch, our teacher read to us, made us put our heads on the desk for a bit.
I had a 9th grade English teacher who read to us from The Merchant of Venice. It's always been my favorite Shakespeare.
Yeah. Yeah, it was like the original form of audio. To have music. Whenever we were teaching a certain part of history, we had some tapes. You can do it online with YouTube. Find the music of that period to play in the background, because the art of a people, their language, their music, their paintings and drawings tends to kind of encapsulate how they view the world. It's really great to have background music, and your kids are like, oh yeah, that's where we were. Whoops. I clicked the wrong thing. Give them something to get their hands on. Do projects. You can throw in a project, and even just one project in a week brightens the whole week up. Take field trips, especially when you're teaching Texas history. We live in the middle of a field trip. You can ride to Gonzales, you can ride to San Antonio. It's not that far to Austin if you can deal with the traffic. You can see and do a lot. Actually, the King Ranch isn't even that far away. And that's a wonderful unit study field trip for the ranching era. Play games. I have on my table my biggest product magnet, in other words, a freebie that you give on your website, is a Texas history game that's played like chronology, if you've ever played that. I just give away the one card pack that deals with the Revolution and Republic. But it's a drill, but you don't know you're drilling because it's a game. People download that, and an awful lot of them come back and get the program later. Because when you're touching something, we remember what happened to us, what we participated in. Taste is a really fun layer to add. We did Greek history and mythology, and then we celebrated when we finished by going out to a Greek restaurant. Both of my children left absolutely horrified because it was the night that they had the belly dancers, and my son was at that age where he was embarrassed by the mere sight of a girl, and here was one decently but fairly scantily clad dancing, and she realized he was blushing, and so she came and stood right by him. And he just was like wanting to put his head under the table. And then at the end of her performance, the tradition is to take your plate and throw it on the floor and break the plate. And our daughter thought, well, that's destructive. I should not do this. It's wasteful. And we were like, darling, it's part of the fun. They expect you to. She says, okay. So she throws her plate down, and she had the one melamine plate in the restaurant. It didn't break. It bounced and went whirling through the air and landed in the middle of the supper of the little boy at the next table. But it was a very meaningful experience. It was memorable to them. We still laugh about, yeah, Mom bombed with that one. But if you can add a taste experience, plant a pizza garden, and then math. You've got manipulatives. We planted a pizza garden, and they got to make whatever they wanted on their quarter of the pizza, and then we sliced it. There's a quarter. Now there's eighths. 2/8 is a quarter. We taught fractions with the pizza. It helped. It wasn't the whole thing, but it brightened the week up. A geography cookbook. If you're teaching geography, cook things from that area of the world. As a literary wrap-up event, you can have a dinner that's a themed dinner based on that. You can really have fun with that. Try Pinterest for ideas. Those are great. Sharing food is a way of sharing relationships, and it makes them feel related with what they're studying. Smell is a unique teaching tool also. Very difficult, challenging to include, but okay, let's do something here. Close your eyes and think of what you smell in your memory when I say Christmas dinner. I see some smiles. You know, when you say, if I had said Christmas Eve, what my husband smells is Glühwein and Lebkuchen. Okay, that's what they had for Christmas Eve. Lots of German cookies, German drink, German, Maultaschen, Spätzle. When I think of Christmas Eve, I think tamales. I grew up in the valley. To me, Christmas Eve is tamales. But it makes it very personal. Smell is very evocative and very personal, and usually you have either a very fond memory of it or it's like, whoa. Okay, an example, whoa. In the old days, doctors used to use smell as part of their diagnosis. If you've ever had a kid that had chicken pox or strep, those bacteria have a strong natural odor. Once you notice it, you will always be able to, I could walk in the bedroom and go, open your mouth. I got to look at your throat. I could smell it before I ever saw it. Once you know what you're looking for. So here are some of my favorite ways to make history a hands-on adventure. You can get to know the characters personally. Go to the library and get a great biography. Costs you nothing. Check one out on Amazon. It costs you nothing. Take a field trip. Most of those cost you nothing. Play a game. Eat what they ate. There's a really good book. I'm trying to think what the author's name is. Maybe one of you has read it. George Washington's Breakfast. Have you read it? It's a little boy who goes to visit his grandmother, and he must think she's very old. And now I have a grandson that age, and he does. He's like, "You didn't see dinosaurs, did you?" "No, darling, thank you." But he asks his grandmother what George Washington ate for breakfast. That's what he wants. And his grandma says, "Well, we'll have to read and find out." And they do. So it's this adventure of reading and finding out, and then she makes it for him. And it turned out to be hoe cakes made from cornmeal mush. And he loved them. Not because anybody really necessarily loves cornmeal hoe cakes, but because of the process that he'd gone through. Foods have eras. I don't know when I figured that out, but the foods our grandparents ate, the foods my mother fixed, are not the foods I fix now. It's just different. So find out what they ate, wear what they wore. If you can get into a reenactment group. Oh, Tom's holding up my water bottle. I read one of Lynn's books, and the characters drank switchel. It was like a field water that it was like before we had Gatorade. They made switchel. It's a splash of vinegar and a dash of ginger, and then molasses or honey sweetening and water. And I add a pinch of organic salt. And it puts the salts and electrolytes back in your body. It's really good. But I never drink it without, I think of you 3 times a day when I empty my water bottle. But you can wear what they wore. We joined a reenactment group, and my kids were docents for one of the old homes in our hometown. And they cooked over a fireplace in the kitchen. They fetched wood. They poured water out of a demijohn. My son had to wear a wool trousers in the summer. That's what they wore. It's hot. My daughter and I wore hoop skirts. You know how difficult it is to climb stairs in a hoop skirt? You have to be real careful not to flash the people coming up behind you and trip on your own skirts. Whoops. What happened? Ah, there it is. Where'd it go? It's making sure it's me, but it's not. It's you. Stick your pen in there.
Do it the old-fashioned way.
Thank you. Okay. Just generally doing what they did puts you literally in their shoes so that you can realize it. This is becoming, I think, more and more important in our current day, because we take people from other times and other cultures and we try to judge them by our time and our culture. They didn't see it that way. And sometimes the way they did see it is horrifying to us. We're like, you thought, what? But at their time, in their place, it made perfect sense. Okay? Trying to think of a non-controversial example. Okay. One of my husband's ancestors outlived 3 wives, and between the 3 women, he had 16 or 17 children. The women died in childbirth. If you were a young man, you expected that you would start a family because there was no other alternative. There was no way to prevent it at the time. And that 1 in 4 women died in childbirth. If your beloved bride birthed your 4th child and was still alive to raise them, you beat the odds. You know, it was sad, but they did. To us, it's like, ugh, how do you live? J.S. Bach, he and his wife had, I think, 18 children, and 3 of them lived to adulthood, and he outlived his wife. And you're like, how on earth can a man like that still write beautiful praise songs? In that time and in that culture, it was to be expected. They didn't like it. It just was to be expected. So there's lots of things like that, whether we're talking about simple day-to-day living things or the idea that you're going to die by the time you're 45 or 50, because they didn't have medicine that we did. Or whether you're talking about something like slavery, which is a whole lot more serious. But the fact that it was to be expected does not necessarily equate with they liked it and thought nothing of it. They didn't have to like it. They just didn't know how to change it. But we do. But knowing that makes the difference. And sometimes the best way to know that is to get your hands dirty in the dust of history to kind of put their shoes on. That's one thing I did. When I taught the Civil War, our activity in my co-op class, I had the children put their shoes on the wrong feet. It keeps going off. And then we walked around our church 2 or 3 times. And they were like, why did we do that? I said, well, in the mid-1800s, there was no left or right shoe. They were all made on the same last. That's the form. They learned a new vocabulary word. And so you walked in, you put whatever shoe, you put it on your foot, and you walked that way, and you laid them side by side so you could repeat and break them in. Took a long time to break them in so they were comfortable. And when the heels wore down, you switched and started all over. Wore down the other side, but they were going to have to be broken in for that side until you had walked the soles off. I said, now think how far it is if you're walking from Texas to Virginia, because you're too poor to have a horse. You certainly don't have a slave. You're a frontiersman, and you're walking to Virginia for the opportunity to be shot. Why would you do that? What was your vested interest that would make it worth that much discomfort and that much risk and that much inconvenience? It just adds a whole new perspective that slavery was undeniably a reason, but probably not the only, because it doesn't explain why everyone went, just some. So these are discussion starters, and they help us kind of parse through, okay, we had lots of interesting conversations. On the something to know category there, children are born curious. The first thing they do when they can crawl is grab stuff off the floor and stuff it in their mouth. Because they want to know. My daughter now is asking our 3-year-old granddaughter, Abigail, why did you do that? Because I wanted to. It's like, she was curious. She wanted to see what would happen. My son wanted to see what happened when he picked up a nail and shoved it in a 220 outlet in Germany. He found out. He dropped it right quick and he went, ow. Yeah, I guess so. But he didn't do it again. There are some things it's better not to learn hands-on, maybe. But there's so many interesting ways to teach anything. Before you try and get them to memorize the chemical elements table, ask them if they realize this is God's recipe book. Everything he made in the whole world was made from these 118 ingredients. Now, if you had 118 items in your pantry, could you cook forever and ever and ever and ever and never make the same thing twice? That's pretty interesting. We were driving down the road one time, and I thought I was being especially good as a homeschool mom. Oh, look, David, there's an armadillo. He says, yes, a 9-banded armadillo. Did you know that the mommy armadillo can stay pregnant as long as she needs to? If there's a drought or if there's some sort of danger, she can wait and just extend her pregnancy and have the babies later when it's safe. And she always has 4 identical quadruplets. And I'm like, nope, didn't know that. You can teach them secret tricks, like how to memorize their 3s and 9s table, that the digits always add up to something that's divisible by 3. Or that our sun is actually a star. That was one of the things to tell that our kids did, and they told their grandmother, my mom, our sun is a star. Its name is Sol. And she said, our sun is a star? I said, what did you think it was? She said, I thought it was the sun. I said, it is. And the other stars are all, the sun in their system. She says, in their solar system, right? I said, no. We call it a solar system because our star's name is Sol. Theirs is a different. It's a different system named after the star that's their sun. She's like, okay, we have to stop now. My mind. But it keeps children interested. I keep talking too long. I'm so sorry. There we are. Okay. So we've talked about some of the ideas of things you can do. It does not have to be fancy. And this is also a good reason to keep that planner in pencil, because when you have an idea, it's always worthwhile to do the stuff instead of do another 3 pages of workbook. But give your children real life experiences. My kids learned so much helping me lay a patio. We did a brick and sand patio. We had to measure and figure the perimeter so we'd know how much wood to buy. We had to figure the area so we'd know how much sand to buy. We had to figure the square inches so we'd know if the number of bricks we had was enough to fill it. In fact, we started with that and talked about the sizes. We had X many bricks, old bricks we wanted to use, and that's how we based the perimeter and the other. And then we laid it out with a knotted string that had knots at 3 feet, 4 feet, and 5 feet to check the squareness of the corners, and we talked about the 3, 4, 5 triangle and the Pythagorean theorem. It was a great, and they were like, do we have to go in and do math now? I said, you just did math. We did? Yeah. Well, let's do more of that. They liked it. And find shapes in the clouds and stars. We took a free astrology class, astronomy, I always mix those up, astronomy course from a guy that wrote columns for our local newspaper. It's great. With kids laid on blankets and found the stars. I could have just made them look at a star chart in a textbook, but the night classes in the summertime were way more fun. They could start hobbies, collections, join interest groups, craft parties, craft circles. In doing that, my kids met a lot of interesting people from all over town, all ages, all interests, diverse backgrounds. Socialization really wasn't a problem. They found people with common interests, which is how most of us make friends as adults, right? They can volunteer for like community service projects and stuff. They can just shadow you. My kids learned to cook by helping me cook. And then I turned more and more of it over to them, and now they can feed themselves, if pressed. There's some place to go. Homeschooling is really home-based schooling. I talked about how in Texas we live in the middle of a field trip, but it's not just that one subject. You can think about where you could go to see people doing whatever it is you're studying and why it matters. We stopped along the roadside one time to watch a farmer bringing in cotton. And when he got back to our turn, he stopped and asked what we were doing. I said, I'm just letting the kids watch you to see where our clothes come from. He says, well, pile them up here with your permission. And he drove them up and down a row, and his harvester had big arms off the side, so he was doing 8 rows at a time. And he got to the end and he did a big sweep and rode back. And when we got back, they were like, oh wow, we just cleared 16 rows. I said, look how big full the hopper is. Wow, that much cotton. And we picked up one bowl that was windblown on the side of the road, and they picked the seeds out of it on the way home, and then we finger spun it. And those 2 bowls made we crocheted them into a little square, blanket sampler, if you will. And I said, now think how many blankets were in that field. How many pairs of jeans, how many pillowcases and sheets, how many bath towels. This was one of our number 1 state crops. I'm like, oh, they got it. Historical sites are all over around here. Cultural communities. I'm very sad that the Institute of Texan Cultures has closed for a year. They got in trouble during COVID with the funding not being enough when they had to close to support their building. It's an older building. And so they've closed for a year. They are relocating it. But they do a great folk festival. And I think they're going to try and keep that going even while they're relocating. But they have booths that they invite people from every culture group that's settled in the state. It's an all-in-one stop where you can hear the music, watch them dance, taste their food, buy their crafts, try some of it yourself. It's a good time. Check my time, speaking of time. Okay, we're nearly done. I took them to sit on city council meetings. We had a membership at the zoo. Just anything you can think of to learn about life. If you do even one a week, I guarantee it will make a difference in your children's desire to become a lifetime learner. So in closing, your kids are going to remember only 10% of what they read, only about 20% of what you yap at them, what I yap at them. You'll probably only remember 20% of what I told you. But if you experience it, 70%. And if you get a chance to share what you learned with other people, 90. So there's not any reason at all not to pull out all the colors in the crayon box and layer on the goodness. Thank you very much. Any questions or comments or?
Thank you
You're very
much.
welcome.
That was great.
That was a lot. I hope I didn't open the fire hydrant and drown you. You're welcome.